and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. As the U.S. and South Korea celebrate 70 years of alliance, the threat posed by North Korea remains very real. Amid shifting regional dynamics, what choices must South Korea make? Today, we discuss these issues with former U.S. government officials who formulated and implemented North Korea policy.
"70 years of relationship that has grown from a key security alliance into a vital global partnership, one that's broadening in scope and significance seemingly every day."
북한이 핵을 사용할 경우 한미 동맹의 압도적 배후를 통해 북한 정권을 종식시킬 것입니다.
And I would presume if I lived there, I would be disturbed by that lack of balance and would be wondering how that could be remediated.
In the studio with me, Dr. Victor Cha, Korea Chair and Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is a distinguished university professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Cha was the Director of Asian Affairs in the National Security Council during the Bush administration and was also the Deputy Head of the U.S. delegation to the Six-Party Talks. Dr. Cha is NBC News and MSNBC Foreign Affairs contributor. He co-authored Korea, A New History of South and North. Also joining us, Mr. Sidney Seiler, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Seiler was former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council until July of this year. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as a Senior Analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, Dr. Cha and Mr. Seiler, you shaped and led U.S. government's North Korea policy, and now North Korea claims to be a nuclear weapon state. North Korea is estimated to have 30 nuclear weapons. So has the U.S. policy failed, or was it impossible to solve North Korean nuclear problem to begin with? Dr. Cha.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think if we look at it absolutely in terms of whether they do or don't have nuclear weapons anymore, in that respect, the policy has failed. But even before I say that, I should say that the policy has less of a chance to succeed now because the U.S. government no longer has Sid Seiler. I think Sid, I count Sid among the two people in the U.S. government that had the most experience on this issue. As you described, he, because of his intel and also policy background, and then the other person is Sung Kim. These are the two people that had the most experience. And now we're down to one, and who knows, Sung is getting old. He's going to retire soon, and then we'll be down to zero. So then we'll really be unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. But I think there are successes of the policy too. I think one of the important successes is that we have been able to deter North Korea from doing anything beyond some of these missile tests and nuclear tests. They certainly haven't carried out a second invasion of the Korean Peninsula. This is the 70th anniversary of the armistice, and we shouldn't just take that for granted. That's important, and it speaks to the strength of the U.S.-South Korea deterrent. We've also been able to bring together the three allies in a way that we never have in the past, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, as was evidenced in the Camp David summit. Although it's difficult now, we have 10 UN Security Council resolutions that were signed on to by China and Russia. Like I said, it's difficult now, but we shouldn't discount these things. They were not easy to get. And so in that sense, yes, in terms of the ultimate goal, we're still very far from it, which is disarming North Korea. But at the same time, I wouldn't completely say the policy was bankrupt because it did accomplish certain things along the way.
Mr. Seiler, did the U.S. government just kick the can down the road?
No, I think Victor captured the many successes that we did achieve along the path of making the best lemonade we could with the lemons that we had before us. These were policy decisions made in Pyongyang as it sought to find a path towards what it perceived was an optimal way of survival in the post-Cold War era, when it felt itself with the socialist bloc collapsing and abandoning North Korea on its own and seeking to find a way to carve out some, sovereignty in an otherwise hostile world. And the decisions that the regime made along the way, walking away from the agreed frameworks for the pursuit of the HEU program, rejecting ultimately a serious forward movement with the Bush administration during the six-party talks, walking away within weeks of the Leap Day understanding during the Obama administration, and again in Hanoi, walking away from an opportunity to take the offers that President Trump was then making. These are repeated policy failures on Pyongyang's part.
Dr. Cha, another thing that the United States didn't try before was preemptive action against North Korea's missile launches, which you mentioned at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. So is that worth considering at this point?
So what I was talking about is that I think that if there is a situation where North Korea has a missile that is on the launch pad, and we have good reason to believe that they will launch that not on a lofted trajectory, but on a flattened trajectory in the direction of Hawaii, Guam, California, or Alaska, then we should be very clear that we reserve the right to intercept that in mid-course or to take it out on the platform. So it is not calling for a preemptive strike against North Korea's military missile arsenal. It is saying that in the event that we see that sort of situation, we need to deter North Korea from testing an ICBM on a flattened trajectory.
When North Korea is on rampant missile launches, especially since last year, shouldn't the United States send that message that we can take those missiles down, Mr. Seiler?
When it comes to national security, bluffing is something you want to seek to avoid. And if you don't have a degree of confidence that the type of missile launch that you're anticipating poses the direct imminent threat that, as Victor's scenario included, that an ICBM, for example, that was headed towards the United States, that credibly looked like it could hit U.S. territory. If you're not going to act, then that threat will over time become meaningless, and it will only reinforce either the futility of our policy or some lack of confidence in our missile defense capabilities. The truth of the matter is, as objectionable as these dozens of missile launches that we've seen over the last 3 years, or cumulatively over hundreds, is that notice to airmen, the absence of notice to airmen, notice to mariners aside, they have not put human lives at risk. And so North Korea has found this sweet zone where it can raise tension and misbehave in this domain without generating a response that incurs too much diplomatic or military blowback.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cha, in your book, Korea, A New History of South and North, you say North Korea is resilient until the day that it is not. Mm. At that point, its demise will be less surprising to the world than its unexpected survival decades after the end of the Cold War. So, to that day, do you think the United States is ready for that day? And is there a system in place with consulting with South Korea when that critical moment comes?
So I don't think anybody's going to be ready for that day when it comes, whether we're talking about the United States, South Korea, or any of the other parties, including China and Russia. I think North Korea's collapse, unification is inevitable. But at the same time, for governments, it's a hard thing to plan for because we don't know the form it'll take. And governments are too busy worrying about what's directly in front of them rather than what's down the road as a hypothetical, unless we're talking about war, right? I mean, militaries plan, the only hypothetical militaries plan for is war, right? War contingencies. And so we do have plans at the military level with regard to North Korea instability. But my concern there is that beyond sort of the military plans, are we ready for everything that comes with a North Korea collapse in terms of everything from demography to health to migration to politics? That I don't think anybody's prepared for. And like I said, as you say, we said in the book, North Korea, we could be here 30 years from now talking about North Korea and we wouldn't be surprised. But we could be here on Monday knowing that North Korea collapsed over the weekend and we would still not be surprised. So that's sort of the range of, that is sort of the range of probability or improbability that we have with regard to North Korea.
And Dr. Cha, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing that you testified, Senator Mitt Romney said, I'm concerned that South Korea has a nuclear neighbor and that if I lived there, I'll be disturbed by the fact that lack of balance and would be wondering how that could be remediated. Are Republicans more sympathetic to South Korea wanting their own nuclear weapons? And if there is a future US president, would that future president let South Korea have its own nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think maybe there are Trump Republicans that feel that way. I don't see Governor Romney, Senator Romney, as a Trump Republican. He represents sort of traditional, moderate American Republican foreign policy, and I don't think that group argues for nuclearization of South Korea. I frankly think a lot of discussion of South Korean nuclearization is a bit overblown. It's based on two polls that we saw coming at two private institutions that put out these polls of the general public, not the strategic elite. I think the view among the strategic elite is very different. They have a much more nuanced view of the costs and benefits and the costs and benefits and the obstacles to South Korea feeling its own nuclear force, because there's a lot that goes into that. So I don't think that his question was suggesting or reflecting a view in the Republican Party that they are somehow more in favor of South Korean nuclearization than the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think from my perspective today, when we look at deterrence, there is no level of South Korean nuclear armament that could begin to match the deterrence that North Korea faces in the U.S. Extended deterrence commitment to the Republic of Korea and its mutual defense commitments to the Republic of Korea and all elements of our alliance that make us, we're in this game together, we're in this boat together. As long as the alliance remains solid, and of course that means whoever's occupying the White House is committed to alliances in the first place. As long as the alliance remains solid and the U.S. remains committed to non-proliferation principles, then I don't see this as a viable possibility. That said, never say never. And that's why we need to continue to consult and continue to demonstrate to the Republic of Korea that the U.S. is a reliable ally.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Seiler, North Korea drawing closer to Russia in recent months may be part of the resilience and survival DNA that Dr. Cha talks about in his book. Sergei Lavrov will visit Pyongyang this month, and also Putin is expected to visit as well. Now, will North Korea and Russia accelerate their economic and military cooperation? And will the implications from that security arrangement, should we be so concerned about that?
Absolutely, we need to be concerned about that. When you reflect upon what turned the Soviet Union from its commitment to the DPRK to the Republic of Korea in the early 1990s, it was because at that time the Soviet Union, later Russia, saw more value in the relationship with South Korea than North Korea. North Korea was a burden, it was an ally in name only, and the conditions of 1950 were entirely different throughout the remainder of the Cold War and even in the post-Cold War period. The dangerous shift right now is that we see this alignment of priorities between Russia and North Korea. Both are arming for its part. Putin is, for his part, he's trying to sustain a war. He sees value in that. Kim Jong-un is trying to enhance capabilities in the conventional and WMD round. Both are openly confronting the international order and defying it and rejecting its basic fundamentals. And both are seeking to justify their actions by demonstrating some emerging bloc. And so these are trends are in a very nascent stage, and I don't believe they're inevitable. I think they can be reversible. And I think through robust diplomacy, particularly with China, we can take some measures to mitigate how destabilizing this is for the peninsula. But Beijing has to understand that if this is unaddressed, and we see a strengthening of North Korea's conventional and WMD capabilities, the destabilization of Northeast Asia that China has articulated concern about for all these years will become very real.
Mm-hmm.
The meetings, going to the space station, the defense show, all these sorts of things are fine. The real question is what's following that. And so in satellite imagery, commercial satellite imagery that we're taking, we see a dramatic uptick in rail cars on the North Korea-Russia border, right? The Kasan rail passing. There is a dramatic increase. We've been monitoring that border for a while. We've never seen this many rail cars. And we don't know what's in them because there's tarp covering them, but we have good images that show dramatic increase. So this is not just niceties going back and forth. There are real transactions taking place. And they are worrying in my respect. We don't know if it's munitions going to Russia or it's something coming from Russia into North Korea, but there's traffic there that has followed that summit meeting.
Dr. Cha, South Korea, Japan, and China are preparing to have a trilateral summit, possibly later this year. The Yoon administration has abandoned the previous administration's approach to China as a strategic partner. The Yoon administration first solidified relations with the United States and Japan, and now it is out to manage relations with China. Going forward, how should South Korea approach China?
I think the Yoon administration really has taken a position that I probably said too, I would have liked to see South Korea take for a long time, which is the only way to approach China is when you have a very strong relationship with the United States and a very strong trilateral relationship. No country in the world can deal with China on its own. And if South Korea tries to deal with China on its own and tries to be solicitous of China, China will treat it as a province because they have a very hierarchical view of international affairs. So in this sense, I think they obviously need to focus on the economic relationship with China. On the security side, very clearly they would like China's help on North Korea, but although that's not going to be forthcoming at any time soon, to me, the really tricky part for the Yoon government is how they manage Taiwan policy, because the Yoon government has said much more on Taiwan than any previous South Korean government. I think it's the right thing to say, because there's a lot of concern about two contingencies at the same time, right? A Taiwan contingency, a North Korea contingency. These are all things that seem very remote, very hypothetical, but I think the war in Europe has caused everybody to think that these things, we can't think of these things as remote. They are possible and we need to plan for them.
Mr. Seiler, October 1st was the 70th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and South Korea. There's much fanfare, but some in South Korea are calling for dismantling of the UN command and pursuit of end-of-war declaration. If these materializes, what scenario will unfold?
Great question, and without leveraging any accusations, it's not surprising that these are long-standing DPRK rhetorical demands challenging the legitimacy of U.S. force presence under the UN flag, misuse of the UN flag for an illegitimate occupation of the South, and perpetuation of inter-Korean tensions. And that just doesn't really withstand the scrutiny of reality. The United Nations Command itself is crucial in terms of bringing in the multinational effort to defense of the Republic of Korea, both in armistice and, heaven forbid, in a time of conflict. They also play a significant role in administering an armistice that has kept peace on the peninsula for 70 years. Not a perfect peace, not interrupted by North Korean kinetic and lethal provocations along the way, but the type of peace that has led to the prosperity not only of Republic of Korea, but Japan and China is a beneficiary of United Nations Command and the work it does in keeping the armistice. The call for an end-of-war declaration, it distracts attention away from the fundamental causes of tension on the peninsula, which is not the result of some technicality that we're in armistice and not in peace, or that one side or the other didn't declare an end to the war. The war has ended. We know that. What hasn't ended is North Korea's aperiodic increasing of tensions for coercive and compellence objectives vis-a-vis the Republic of Korea in particular, but the United States as well. So an end-of-war declaration does not necessarily resolve that issue. So these calls, and of course, if it was just a neutral call, like who doesn't want peace? but a call for actions that would potentially challenge the peace by weakening the US-ROK alliance, limiting our exercises, limiting our strategic deterrence deployments, or even at some point calling for an abandonment of the Mutual Defense Treaty, then the end state on the ground is much more dangerous than it is today in the absence of an end of war statement.
Dr. Cha, some American politicians endorse America First policy and express skepticism about America's role as the world's policeman. And the latest poll by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, 50% of American respondents favored using U.S. military if North Korea invaded South Korea, 49% opposed. If the U.S. reverts back to isolationism, will the U.S.-ROK alliance be able to withstand that political changes?
Well, I'm always cautious about looking at public opinion polls as sort of being the barometer by which we think about U.S. willingness to commit to an ally if it's been attacked. I mean, look, if you did a public opinion poll before the war in Ukraine and said, should the United States support, they'd be like, they're not a treaty ally, they're not in NATO, why should we support them, right? And yet, here we are, the United States playing a large role in this. So I think certainly there's concerns in Asia about U.S. isolationism. With our elections coming up in a year from now, there's a lot of concern about that.
Especially with President Trump being the front runner in the Republican race.
Sure. I mean, I think that, rightfully there's a lot of concern about that. But I would also say that at the same time, many of the things that have been done in the state visit in April and in the Camp David summit in August were meant to institutionalize new ways for the U.S. and Korea and Japan to cooperate. On the U.S.-Korea bilateral side, they create the Washington Declaration, the creation of the NCG, the port calls. All these things are important for institutionalizing new forms of cooperation that reinforce extended deterrence and reinforce the U.S. commitment to Korea. And so I think in that sense, those things will continue. It would be a big deal if they stopped. If the United States decided to stop those things, it would be a huge, huge issue. But I think we've seen very clearly from this war in Ukraine what happens to militaries if they don't exercise, right? And we saw during a period of time there were no exercises taking place between the U.S. and South Korea. If anybody thinks that those don't matter in terms of maintaining credibility of deterrence, and as Sid said, credibility of deterrence equates to peace on the peninsula. If deterrence is not credible, then peace is in jeopardy. If they don't believe that those things are important, all they have to do is look at Russian performance in Ukraine, right? So I think these things will continue despite our domestic politics here in the United States.
Mr. Seiler, as a final note, do you think the institutionalization of the trilateral cooperation between U.S., South Korea, and Japan is strong enough to withstand any presidential decisions in the future?
I like to believe, I like to look at bigger trends and more underlying principles in terms of why the three leaders decided to come together at Camp David and take the commitment to institutionalize and strengthening the trilateral relationship over time. And those principles, our shared values, our shared threats that we're seeking to counter, our shared interest in on many global issues, those will not change depending on who's in the Youngsan presidential office or who's in the White House. And so my confidence in that, and I have had the fortune of being through in important senior positions during many power changes on the U.S. side as well as the ROK side. And guess what? We've survived. We've survived some rough patches, to be sure, but the principles remain unchanged. And so I'm more optimistic that this institutionalization, well, it won't be perfect, and there won't be efforts by a potential future leader to overturn parts of it, that the principles will bring some longevity to the directions that we've set out on.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Cha, Mr. Seiler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.